Welcome back to the podcast and welcome back to the second appendix of William Bartley's book, The Retreat to Commitment. As I mentioned at the end of the last podcast, these two parts are quite connected. There's no great spot where to cut them, but it was simply running too long. And I don't want to overburden the listener with an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 20 minutes of a podcast. I know they're much more manageable in bite sizes, and I know that even 30 minutes perhaps is a little too long. And I'll do my best in future to keep this in mind as I record the rest of the series. But for now, I'm going to wind back about a minute, maybe 30 seconds into the last podcast, just to give listeners a little feel for where we're coming from. But the real feel for it is going to require you to go back and listen to the first half, at least the first half of this particular podcast, this particular appendix. So with that said, let's get into it. Now, Bartley believes, and he's going to go on to show here, that the problem of induction, as it always exists, is simply a problem of demarcation, or a problem of demarcation if you approach that problem in terms of justificationism, which is true for all those other problems that he mentioned just earlier. Those great problems of philosophy that people call, and the quote Bartley has here is perennial, the ones that never seem to go away and run from generation to generation. Those so-called insoluble ones that never seem to show any type of progress whatsoever. That's simply due to what he calls here unconscious and uncritical justificationism. So after this grand entry, we should ask Bartley just what a non-justificationist project would look like. And is such a thing even possible within science and within logic? Perhaps more specifically, what does non-justificationist criticism look like? Is it not necessary, and this is how the traditional argument has gone, that to have effective criticism, you need to have some sort of authority, something which is beyond criticism or unchallengeable, and something which those good ideas are all reducible to in some way, or derivable from, or justifiable in relation to. So Bartley's going to start showing how this can be done otherwise with a two-step process. So first, of course, you have to start with a very Popperian statement that at all steps in the process, all of our arguments, every single individual step, including our logically derived arguments, are never considered as authoritative or justified in any way whatsoever, but simply as unjustified conjectures or hypotheses. And then secondly, you've got to stand the entire structure upon its head and put the hypotheses, which is under consideration, inside the premises of the argument, and put the observational reports, which are to be brought to criticism, in the conclusion. So turn the thing around. The conclusion becomes the premises, and the premises become the conclusion. Now, this is going to be much easier when you see it in action here. So Bartley is going to take us back to his description of planets and their movement through space. So the original argument, the inductive argument, ran like this. It began with observational premises, and these were: Mars is a planet that moves in ellipses. Number 2, Jupiter is a planet that moves in ellipses. And 3, Earth is a planet that moves in ellipses. Those are the premises. The conclusion being, the inductive conclusion being, that all planetoid objects move in ellipses. Of course, the argument's invalid, and we've explained why already. Because the conclusion has more logical strength than the premises do. But if you turn it around, as he is encouraging us to do here, it goes like this. The premises now become: 1, all planetoid objects move in ellipses. 2, Mars is a planetoid object. The conclusion being, Mars moves in an ellipses. So let's run it like this. Let's analyze it in this way. Imagine that the conclusion is found out to be false. That after observing Mars over and over again, we see that it actually doesn't move in an ellipses. Now, the falsity of the conclusion is retransmitted back into the premises, or at least one of the premises, which is the one about all planetoid objects moving in ellipses. And so we can maintain what ought to be a logical rule of the retransmission of falsity from conclusion back to premises. Now, I don't want to jump the gun here too much. There is an entire appendix on this to come later on in our series. But the point is this. What Bartley is looking for here is a way to make a non-justificationist criticism. So to sum up the difference between the two arguments here, the second and the first is invalid and inductive, the second is deductive and valid. The first one has an asymmetry between verificationism. It's a form of justificationism and has the problem of logical strength to deal with. The second one is one that hinges around falsificationism. It's a form of criticism. And although it's completely impossible to verify any particular law of physics or scientific law of any kind, and to do so in terms of observation statements, Another way of simply explaining what he has done here is by saying that the second argument, the logically valid one, simply has a valid falsifying relationship, but not a valid verifying relationship. The problem that induction makes is by misunderstanding the direction of things, by thinking that an argument runs from singular observations all the way to universal statements and scientific laws, without seeing that disconnect between logical strength. When you look at it, the features of Bartley's new logic make a lot of sense. There is no longer a problem of logical strength, of course, simply a falsifying relationship which is deductively possible between a weaker and a stronger statement. It is also an account of criticism in terms of experimental evidence. And lastly, there's just no authority whatsoever. Even the agent of criticism, as Bartley calls it here, the observational report, which may prove the original premises wrong, is also conjectural. It's non-authoritative, and it's not a verification of any kind, it's not a justification of any kind. Now, of course, the argument often comes that even in this case, the test is made up in terms of an observational statement. That is, it's already decided in advance what kinds of statements would be compatible and which ones would not be compatible. And therefore is a type of justificationism. And then you go ahead and you set up the experiment to simply try and arrange and attempt to produce these events. But suppose that the test goes against the theory, as it does in the hypothetical example that Bartley put forward, with the observation that Mars does not in fact move in an ellipsis. Well, the theory is now problematic, of course. It's been definitively criticized in terms of the test itself. It is, of course, false in relationship to the test reports. And those test reports, at that particular moment, are considered unproblematic until they are considered otherwise, of course. Which means that what you have is something provisional, something conjectural, which needs to be rejected, simply because it conflicts with something that is unproblematic, or perhaps less problematic. You don't justify one theory in terms of the other, but you also don't seek to maintain as many problems within the theory as possible. You hope to solve them, and when some have been solved, you have a direction of movement. A direction of movement which is still, of course, conjectural and still open to its own criticism, always revisable, and just like everything else is in the world. The criticism here is always non-justificational, which is the point. And importantly, the problem of induction has completely disappeared. In its place, nothing more than a simple conjecture and an attempt to refute that conjecture. Bartley here is moving on to another problem, which is realism. And it is connected to what he's just been speaking about there. And in the lead up to this, he goes on to say that just like the problem of induction, a lot of those other problems in philosophy simply disappear when you accept that everything is unjustifiable and you turn logic on its head. These include statements about the mind and about morality, about the external world, and you simply ask the question, which is, within a non-justificational framework, how can these statements and statements like them and the claims we make about the world be adequately criticized? And the solution runs just as we have seen with the problem of induction. That is, scientific laws have potential falsifiers which are observational. These are singular statements about the universe or about some sort of existential form out there. And these things are observable events that will occur in a particular space, a particular region of space and time. They are basic statements. Now, of course, many of the other more controversial aspects of science perhaps don't have such obvious falsifiers out there. Controversial claims such as the tradition of epistemology, things like this do not have potential falsifiers that are noticed to conflict with those basic statements. Now, realism, the theory that there is an external world independent of human perception, is, again, not a testable theory in this sense, or not a testable in the sense that Popper put forward. That claim about there existing an external world is simply a claim, and one that is completely composed of human perceptions. However, it does turn out to be a basic statement which is incompatible with some other universal laws. The laws that Bartley has in question here are those of biology and evolutionary theory. Now, if you talk about evolution first, we are just simply talking about all forms of life and how diverse they are and how they've coped with their environment and the various structures that they've used and employed and integrated to compete and to complement one another. Now, that's a completely inadequate description of evolution. I'm sure you can find a much better one out there. But the point is this. Bartley's saying, however you describe it, however you think about evolution, and evolution is now one of our best tested theories, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever without reference to a common world. a world in which all these biological forms function, and in which through their evolution they somehow represent as well, something in which they actually interact with and evolve in response to. Each cognitive structure that we have, our senses, our language, can all be explained in terms of natural selection and the relative survival value that those structures have provided us. An external world clearly plays a role in this, one that is independent of our senses. I mean, evolutionary theory, for anyone that takes it seriously, is of course claiming millions upon millions of years prior to our existence in the first place. We simply need an external world, and we need this deep history of our evolution if we're going to explain in any way those perceptual structures that we now have. If someone is to come along and say there is no external world, realism was wrong, that there is no reality beyond human perception, well, from the evolutionary point of view, as Bartley puts it here, it is simply absurd. What you're left with in that case is, again in Bartley's words, either a miracle or a piece of pre-established harmony. Either way, it is, again in his words, a useless encumbrance. Now, the point here is quite simple, actually. Bartley goes into a lot more detail here in this appendix, but really the point is this, that by denying realism through some claim to idealism or some other ideology of the kind, you are claiming something which is contradicted by well-tested laws of science, which are themselves testable in terms of basic statements. And so even if realism itself doesn't have testable basic statements, it is still criticizable. And criticism is always possible. And this is what Bartley's really getting at here. The claim that we can't criticize certain things within science or within philosophy, Bartley is drilling into and saying it is always possible. Simply you must get away from justificationism to see it. And yet Bartley wants to go a little further here. He wants to show something which was long claimed was to be impossible. That is, that factual information relates to and can be an evaluation of moral statement, which is that ought is distinction. Here he is pushing back again on what he sees as a long tradition of Western philosophy that is mired within justificationism. Here he quotes G. Moore as an example of this, who says, "No truth about what is real can have any logical bearing upon the answer to the question of what is good in itself." Or they simply go back to Hume and they say things like that logic and reason have no part in moral arguments. Bartley responds by saying this is clearly false, of course. Truth and facts about the world clearly have bearing of moral value, and moral statements can be sometimes refuted by factual statements. Here again he's thinking about the transmission or the retransmission of falsity. So he starts like this. He says, I'm just going to assume from the outset that ought statements imply can statements, at least in respect to people. So if you're saying in this scenario that someone ought to do something, it is assumed that it must be possible for him to do it as well. Now that part is fairly uncontroversial. If someone were to argue with that, then I'm not really sure where they begin here. Surely morality of any kind is a guidepost to action. If it's not something you can do, then I'm not sure where you begin. Now Bartley's first argument is this, his first valid argument that he puts forward. Now this is an example here. The premise is Jones ought to be a genius. The conclusion being Jones can be a genius. Now suppose that evidence comes along that shows the conclusion to be false. That is simply not capable for Jones to be a genius. That he has suffered in some way an extensive brain damage of some variety. Well, here we have a factual consideration, which is an evaluation and a criticism of a moral claim. The claim that Jones ought to be a genius is proven wrong by the claim that Jones cannot be a genius. And this runs for almost anything. Perhaps you make a moral claim that instead of imprisoning criminals, you ought to treat them psychologically. This is one of the examples that Bartley puts forward. Well, this can only be true if it is actually possible to treat them psychologically. If we can't do it, then the premise must be wrong. Again, factual information bearing upon a conjecture, or at least a premise, a moral premise. But, of course, moral claims are not empirically testable, in the same way that we explained about the problems of realism before. That testability, or at least the notion of testability, is something that refers to something which can be refuted, simply by reports of sensory observation, for example. Now, if you start with Jones can be a genius, and then you observe Jones not being a genius, well, that's not a refutation. It might still be possible that Jones becomes a genius tomorrow, or at some later date. Now, someone may make another claim here about Jones's possibility to become a genius, and to do so in terms of some other law, some other aspect of science which is self-testable, and to infer from that that he's not capable, which of course is entirely valid, but it's a non-observational inference. It is not an observational criticism, but it's still a factual criticism. The laws of physics are facts about the world. And everywhere you look at it, factual criticism and factual criticism of moral injunctions or moral claims always plays a fairly deep role within the claims of morality, or at least an examination of morality. Whenever you have some sort of moral claim, it almost always imposes an obligation of some kind. And yet, if you can show that you have no possibility of fulfilling that obligation, well, you're released from that obligation by definition. And that's the real point here. Bartley's not trying to be exhaustive. He's simply trying to make the claim, or at least push back upon the claim, which for so long damaged the philosophy of morality. And that problem, which again became a perennial problem, which is the ought-is distinction. Bartley's trying to show here that it just isn't true, at least when you get beyond justificationism. So it's the project of Bartley here to show the value and the strength of non-justificational evaluation, and how problems that existed within the history of philosophy for so many years are solved, or can be solved, simply by taking such a non-justificationist approach. In all such cases, the role of observation is not about how to justify, but rather how to winnow down and diminish and criticize. He has a quote here, and it's a fantastic quote, one that I've quoted before in my own writing about Bartley. And this is, "Facts about the world are the grim reapers of our speculations." But of course, there are other considerations here. And the most important one, the one that Bartley thinks has been neglected for too long here, is simply the question of the problem situation. The idea which is under consideration here, which non-justificationism attempts to solve, and whether it actually does so successfully. Now, to pursue the question, as Bartley says, you have to pursue something a little more. You have to pursue a new type of epistemology itself. For, as he will go on to say, it's almost impossible within science and philosophy to find an example of just such a non-justificationist approach to science or philosophy, including, of course, Bartley thinks, within Karl Popper's philosophy. That is, that even when people have thought they have done this, they have smuggled in justification through the back door, and it's always been there to some degree. Or, when push has come to shove, in the case of Karl Popper, you fall back on justificationism and accept it as something perhaps unpleasant, but it's something you might just accept because you think it does a job. But of course, Bartley's going to say here that the supposition that justificationism has been important, or is somehow important, or actually does a job within science or philosophy, is something which is simply a philosophical tradition itself, and not something that plays out in practice when you actually look at the grounds. And of course, if people could see this, if they could see that it simply wasn't successful, in the way that induction simply is not successful, then so much of the mistakes of epistemology of the past could simply be dropped, recognized as obsolete, at least to the extent that they are accounts of justification. Throughout the appendices so far, and most of what Bartley has been discussing here, is something which depends upon recognizing the asymmetry between verification and falsification. However, he will say here that this is one of those things that, even when it's claimed to be understood, is often misunderstood. There is a question here, and the question that runs us back to Popper, and that is, what is the relationship between evidence and what is evidenced? This is something that must be of interest to every empiricist out there, everyone who is in any way orientated towards scientific discovery. Now, Popper, of course, has his answer, and this is somewhat of a quote. What is the relationship between observational evidence and reports and theoretical statements about the world? Well, Popper's answer is a falsifying relationship and not a verifying relationship, of course. And this runs back to Bartley in obvious ways too. But Bartley's going to say here that Popper didn't even realize, and perhaps didn't recognize, that the way in which he drew this relationship, in fact, diminished the significance, the philosophical significance of that relationship itself. Now, throughout the history of philosophy, that relationship between theory and observation has been so important and such a stumbling block simply because of the assumption, and this is Bartley here, because of the assumption that observation is the source of justification. And justification is the source of all knowledge of any kind. When you drop the assumption itself, the significance also changes. And the question changes back to what Bartley mentioned in the first appendices. Less a question of the relationship between theory and observation, and more what he called the problem of the ecology of rationality. Now, he's not trying to say that what Popper is most interested in here is of no importance to philosophy. It is and will always be important to recognize how any theory you create about the world actually relates to the world and what you can observe about the world. Of course, we go back to that quote of his, "Facts about the world are the grim reapers of our speculations" here. And of course, if there is no relation, or there does not relate between theory and observation, well, that's important to know too, simply so you can enhance or examine the theory in more detail or in different ways. No matter how you look at it, the most important diminisher of power of any theory is obviously, or in most cases, going to come from observation. And he goes on to quote and to speak about scientists in the lab themselves and their experience within the lab. And he has a quote here from Donald Campbell. And he says that within these laboratories, the researcher's experience looks like this, that experimentation is predominantly frustrating and disappointing. What those scientists are increasingly encountering are the grim reapers of their speculations. And so if you're going to pursue this, and not so much pursue Bartley's ecology, then the demarcation problem does matter, and it does come back into things. And of course, Popper's answer to this was to demarcate science from non-science, science from pseudoscience. And to do so, of course, along those grounds, that science is testable on observation, and pseudoscience is not testable. That nothing you could observe at any point could ever prove the pseudoscience wrong. Now, of course, this identification itself, this demarcation, places outside science and the theories of science principles that have played an important role within science. What he's talking about here is not science itself, but philosophy, of course. And as Bartley mentioned earlier in his discussion of realism, there can be principles about the world which are completely compatible with observation, and yet nonetheless do conflict with testable scientific theories, and so are criticizable in terms of those scientific theories. And perhaps you should call these things theory refutable, as opposed to observation refutable, to designate those things where there is no empirical possible refutation. I mean, compare two statements, for example. Now, the first is that every substance has its solvent, and this is irrefutable, of course, in the sense that no empirical refutation is possible. It is in fact compatible with the claim that gold has never been observed to dissolve, for example. There's still the possibility out there that there is a solvent out there for gold, and it will dissolve. But it is incompatible and refuted by the theory that gold is insoluble. Since no scientific theory can ever be fully verified by experience itself, therefore it remains possible that any particular hypothesis may be falsified at some future date by some future experiment or some future experience, and that the conflict between a scientific theory and an irrefutable statement might at some later point in time be proved to not to be a conflict at all. Now, the conflict between untestable and untestable theories has an effect of a kind. Not only does it allow testable theories to exact a type of criticism or critical analysis back upon to untestable theories, but also the untestable principles themselves, the untestable theories, may in fact take the lead and exert a kind of significant regulating effect upon the theories, the testable theories, that they conflict with. And it's for this reason and reasons like it that Bartley doesn't really want to deal with the relationship between theory and observation in the way Popper has. He doesn't want to demarcate between science and non-science. Rather, he wants to do something a bit more neutral. It's far more important, he believes, simply to understand the correct generalization, or at least correct characterization, of the relationship between the theory and the observation than it is to define what science is. Because once you've defined the relationship, then you can begin to understand how they affect each other and what criticism will be valid and what won't. And it's in Popper's earlier writings that Bartley has the more significant problem with him. his more extreme statements, Popper's more extreme statements, at least in relationship between theory and observation and demarcation, well, these tend to take the form of this, and this is a quote, a direct quote from The Logic of Scientific Discovery. It says, "Insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it's not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality." And of course, you can see why Bartley would have a problem with this. Unfalsifiable theories, as he's just explained there, can speak about reality, and they can have bearing upon falsifiable theories. Bartley is saying here that Popper is doing something more. Rather than simply forming a demarcation between science and non-science, by putting it in these terms and claiming that non-scientific theories or non-testable theories don't even speak about reality, he's making a demarcation between what is good and what is bad. And it is here that Bartley gives Popper some credit, because Bartley saw those early works of Popper, was incredibly critical of them, relayed that information back to Popper, and is now saying in his own works that thankfully Popper has changed his mind. And he now understands, with the significant amount of credit owed back to Bartley, that there is what he calls a rich fusion between untestable theories and testable theories. And this is most obvious, Bartley says, in Popper's own work on the philosophy of biology, for example, in Popper's defense of indeterminism against determinism, and with his work with John Eccles on the mind-body problem. Okay, on to the last point in this particular appendix, which is the problem of evolution, ecology, and demarcation. And it begins with a question, which is, what then is the criteria of demarcation between good ideas and bad ideas? Now, I'll let you pause on that for just a moment. What do you think Bartley's answer is to this? It's a simple one, but it makes some sense once you begin to read his philosophy, and once you begin to see his criticism, and once you begin to understand just how allergic he is to justification. His answer is, there is none. There are, of course, things you may desire to have within a theory, and other things which, once you see them within a theory, might ring alarm bells in your ears. And these are things like testable content and high empirical content, but they are not criteria for good and bad. Their presence is never required. And any theory which lacks such things still may turn out to be a wonderfully formed, perfectly elegant, true theory. And the same goes for the kind of things which you see within theories that you may not like. So things like inconsistency or incoherence. Now, these are clearly bad things to have within a theory. But it does not stand from that particular analysis that their contraries are criteria for goodness. All you're saying is these are criteria for undesirable things to have within a theory. But they do not, in and of themselves, make a good theory or a bad theory. So the question continues then. How then do we get from worse ideas to better ideas? How do we remove the bad ones from the good and the bad qualities from the good? And Bartley has an answer here, and he's going to use Donald Campbell again. And his answer is the general theory of fit. Now that's a quote from Donald Campbell, who worked for a lot of his career on evolutionary epistemology. And of course Bartley thinks that the answer here is an evolutionary one, is an ecological one. It's about how animals best adapt to their environments. And it just so turns out that a non-justificational theory of criticism parallels quite neatly to a neo-Darwinian account of evolution and adaptation. And the justificational theory, on the other side of criticism, has its own parallel, which is to Lamarckian evolution, or at least the Lamarckian theory of evolution, which we don't really have time to go into here. And this makes perfect sense, though, simply from the outside on a cursory look. Because evolution and the adaptation of animals and plants to their environment is a process of knowledge creation. So evolution, Darwinian evolution, needs 3 steps. These are the 3 steps that Bartley is putting down as a generalization. First, a blind, unjustified variation. Importantly, it is blind and unjustified. Second, a systematic selection and an elimination. And thirdly, of course, the retention and the duplication. So how do we get from good ideas to bad ideas? Well, they demarcate themselves from one another gradually through setting up a deeply competitive environment, a critical environment, a creative environment, and one that which is in accordance with those 3 steps he's just put forward there. And slowly, a winnowing effect of good from bad will be achieved. But if you want to move back to a criteria, then you're moving back to justification, and you're not going to get there in this sense. So, of course, the next question is, what does such an environment actually look like? What does it look like when the epistemologist in question really has set aside all the justificationism that Bartley's been speaking about there? Well, it's a kind of freedom from attachment and a freedom from commitment of all kind, a freedom of identification and a need to never defend your positions, nor the context of those positions, but only focus on one thing and one thing alone, which is the contribution to and the maintenance of a deeply critical, hostile environment to all ideas. That's the only goal. Now, of course, other questions will follow here, just as you would imagine, which is something along the lines of what are the ramifications of such an ecology being actually built and constructed? What would it be like to live within such a lethal culture and to exist without being positionally attached to anything? Would it even be desirable? How do you, for example, create the most lethal possible environment, which is something analogous to systematic selection and elimination, in which therefore the production of creative ideas still come about, which is variation, I suppose, and these ideas nonetheless thrive despite that lethality, and in which our intellectual heritage, and this is the hard question, the intellectual heritage in which we build up, the things we want to preserve, are actually transmitted, which is that question of retention and duplication. So the question is, how do we gear our institutions in this way? How do we gear our own mentality, our own behavior, our own patterns, our own conjectures and ideologies and policies and positions and programs, and it goes on. How do we do this, and how do we provide that phrase that he likes to use, which is optimum criticism? How do we eliminate as much error as possible and also contribute to a fertility of the intellectual environment, for example? How do we create an environment which is not only negative, not only critical, but also encouraging of the creation of new ideas and the development of rationality itself, one that is truly inspirational? Well, Bartley's going to begin here by saying, of course, it's not easy to answer this question, because even the institutions around us, the ones that we might consider to be successful or even somewhat successful, have themselves grown about gradually. They have come about in an evolved process. They are not deliberate inventions of the human mind. They are, of course, creations of human action, but not of human design directly. And we all know that when you tamper with such institutions, it is fraught with a kind of danger. Unintended consequences lurk behind every corner. You don't know what you don't know. And there's always the danger that what you do and what you tinker with is going to make things much, much worse. So a first step in addressing these kinds of questions is, of course, to identify what these institutions already provide within the environment themselves, and what they already can contribute to the elimination of error and to the enhancement of progress and knowledge. And then to discover what within these institutions and which institutions in general work against those things. And this is a little wider ranging than most people might assume. For, even trivial institutions, trivial existing institutions such as linguistic institutions, though they were never developed for such purposes, quite subtly do now exist and hold the same purpose. The point is, and Bartley uses the word here, marked knowledge, that perhaps the goal of this evolutionary kind of understanding is to find so-called theories that are already marked, or to mark theories as those which are already in doubt or question, or already inconsistent, and to embrace the concept itself, not simply to use it as something that should exist, but expand it. Many people out there will, of course, know the physicist David Deutsch, and a turn of phrase that he likes to use around theories. He says, instead of calling something the theory of evolution, let's call it the misconception of evolution, which is to already mark it as potentially wrong. Now, this is a remarkable kind. I don't know if Deutsch has read Bartley, but Bartley prefigures Deutsch here. He says we should do the same thing for our theories. He says every single manuscript that we put up should have the same kind of marking, which reads something along the lines of first draft, or trial balloon, or marked knowledge. And then everyone reading it, everyone listening to this, will understand from the very outset that we're expecting to find criticisms inside. We're expecting to find errors. And there is nothing certain, nothing verified, nothing justified about the theory itself. He says every theory we put forward, every manuscript that we publish, we should have a big label on the front which says damaged goods. Something which tells the reader that the author and the people reading it should be aware and should anticipate constant defects. And we use these kind of advices. I'm sure this is why Deutsch uses it and why he wants to use it. And I'm sure Bartley is onto the same thing here. The language and the theory is so incredibly close to each other. He says we use these kind of things to get to that optimum level of criticism. Devices like this might seem simply linguistic or silly, for example, but what they do is they gear us towards an understanding of the world, something which tells us that knowledge is always defective. And our goal here, of course, is not to delete it too fast or to rush to judgment, but to certainly expect those errors to be there. And, of course, many people will look at this and talk about balance and the evolutionary process and how we find balance within it. But I think balance is the wrong word here. Those 3 evolutionary principles that were put forward by Bartley, and if you disagree with his phrasing, I don't think it's easy to disagree with the core of them. He says they, as they sit on a matrix, are in essential tension with one another. And that's where they must always be. And so there is a question of balance here. They do need to be in balance, but only in the sense that they're balanced in tension against each other. Now, Bartley references a friend of his. This is Paul Feyerabend. And he says Feyerabend clearly overemphasizes the importance of variation. And he says justificationists, on the other hand, will generally at least, overemphasize the importance of retention. And he says Popper overemphasizes the importance of elimination. And this last mistake of Popper's, Bartley thinks, is one which would be quite easily eliminated, at least psychologically, in the minds of many people, by simply doing that thing he was trying to do, which is call all knowledge damaged goods. And then the overemphasis on elimination is no longer something that you're clawing yourself towards. You're accepting it from the beginning. And I do hope now, at least after this second appendix, you can begin to understand why the emphasis in the first appendix was so important on building an ecology. That's what Bartley's trying to do here. He's really focused on an ecological niche here for rationality and how we can build that up and form something which has that kind of constant tension. And then we can no longer have to get dug in and drawn into discussions about demarcation, hard discussions about demarcation and what is good science and bad science and all the rest. We can simply say what Bartley said. There is no distinction, no demarcation between a good idea and a bad one. What you must do is build the best ecology for ideas to flourish and then be destroyed, the most lethal rationalist environment. And once you've built that, you can't prejudice it in any way by imposing ideas such as demarcations upon it. And he just ends this with a simple final point. He says that since the advancement of science and of knowledge and of learning in general is not the only desirable goal of social life, there are other considerations in social life, then the epistemologists that we hope to think that we are, and perhaps also the social reformers out there within society, will have to meet with their opposition. They will have to embrace the conflict, and they have to embrace that conflicts and that meeting as opportunities. And none of this can ever be done if you burden yourself down with a justificationist claim from the beginning, where you attempt to prejudice the direction of science with those such justificationist claims. Now, that was incredibly long, and if you've stuck with me this long, I thank you, of course. Now, the next appendix is much shorter. It is only 5 pages long, and I'm going to do my absolute best in the next appendix to keep it quite short and in a digestible format and size. And for the next chapter, which is quite long, I will definitely break that up into 2 particular sections. So thank you for bearing with me, and from here on out, I'm going to do a much better job of keeping these things short and concise. I'll see you next week.